people's expectations of their career are going to exist outside of companies. That's already happened. There are still people who, you hear of who have worked for Google for 17 years, but I think the newer employees are probably cognizant of the fact that nothing lasts forever and the company has very, very little loyalty to you. And so you return that attitude to the company. Free lunch notwithstanding.
Hi, I'm Boaz, founder of Simply Augmented, and I'm excited that you're tuning in to Shift, a show that explores what it takes to thrive and adapt to the changing workplace in the digital age. If you're a fan of the show, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review. Thank you so much. Charlie, it is great to have you on the show. I'm super, super excited to have this conversation today, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, Charlie, I like to start all the shows by reading off the resumes of the folks that I'm interviewing. I'm going to read it to you. If I get it right, awesome. If I don't get it right, you can kind of push back. But your resume is so incredible, and I'm really, really excited to hear more about some of the pieces that I don't know as much about. So let me go ahead and get started. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
You started as a vice president for Disney. You were part of the concept for The Lion King. You supervised development of that along with a lot of other animated shows and films. You then became the executive vice president and chief operating officer at Virtual World Entertainment, which was super interesting to me because looked like it was a very early VR gaming experience dedicated to gaming centers, which is incredible that you were doing that so early. Next, you were the senior vice president and chief creative officer at AOL in the early days and worked on early internet brands like The Motley Fool and Real Fans Sports Network and so on. From there, you became the founder and CEO of eAgents, raised a venture capital round, and you went on to sign a bunch of syndicated agreements, which I want to hear more about. It sounds super interesting. And then that was acquired, and you became the chief creative officer for American Greetings Interact. And then after doing that, you were the founder of Charlie Company, LLC, and you went on to write a bunch of books. The one that I really want to talk about today is remote collaboration, but I'm also interested in your thoughts on the other two, convergence and metaverse. We'll get into that. I am shocked at the experience and how long you've been in this game. So did I get it right? Was I close?
Yeah, you were close. Thank you.
Awesome.
It was everything I could do to keep from commenting on each of the jobs because, I always feel like I failed my way upward.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, I just always, I have had my entire life imposter syndrome. So it may be in my 60s that's finally fading away a little bit. So that's what I meant by that.
I see. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. I think it's an amazing resume, and it's just so interesting based on the things that you write about now for Forbes and, the work that you're doing now as a consultant, just how long you've been in the game. To that end, one of the things I'm interested in knowing is what was your first job, though? What was the first job where someone actually paid you money?
I was a golf caddy when I was a teenager.
That's awesome. What state were you in?
I grew up in suburban New York, in an area called Westchester County, which is a very affluent county, and there are tons of golf courses, many of them dating back to the 18th century.
That's great. So out of the list that I read, what was your favorite job? Like, as you think back on all that stuff that you did, what was the favorite?
Either my time at Disney, although I was under a lot of stress at that time. So that was the bad thing about that job. And also, you didn't really have that much control. So you hate to be in a situation where you don't have any control. So I would say based on that and excluding what I'm doing today, I would say that my favorite job was the first 2 years I worked at AOL. After that, things got to be a bit messy. Although, ironically, that was the period in which the stock ran up and I created, substantial wealth that's enabled me basically to do whatever I want. I spent a lot of money. I tried a lot of different projects. I produced Broadway shows. So I'm a lot less wealthy today. But it has enabled this sort of fifth act of my career, and not many people get a fifth act, right? Most people people close to me lose their jobs in their late 50s and early 60s, and they can't really find another one.
Yeah.
Gen X is rightly wants to see us retiring, get the hell out of the way. Our generation is retiring a little later. That has made advancement for the subsequent generation very slow. First 2 years at AOL were great. We were building the internet. We were running down the halls to keep up.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was crazy.
That
But
must have been so exciting.
I was very fortunate to live through and perhaps make a small contribution to that moment in history of the internet, which is we knew was going to change everything, but oh my God, has it really changed everything because, the smartphone put everything on steroids.
How about those early tell me more about the VR-cade, the VR in malls. I mean, that was super early.
It was networked flight simulators, but rather than putting you in the sky flying at, 600 miles an hour, where it's extremely difficult to see people, right? Out of your display window, you see a digital environment in which you are networked with the other players in the simulation. So we created competitive games around that. One racing game called Red Planet, where you race through the canals of Mars, and we can see a team game called Martian Football,
Nice.
in which big hovercraft blocked for little hovercraft that were very small but very fragile. And, and then we had a game called Battletech, which was much more famous, and that was jousting mechs, a game that could be played as a team game, but was often played as an individual game. We opened 33 locations on 4 continents in 3 years,
Wow.
which is crazy just because the real estate business generally moves at the speed of the Department of Motor Vehicles. That experience transformed me into what passed as a digital media executive in 1995.
Yeah.
Now everyone is a digital media executive. But in 1995, there was a shortage and I passed. And that was very early, in AOL. AOL had just surpassed 5 million members, and they surpassed 20 million members around the time I left. I mean, AT&T to 20 million Americans was the internet for 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, to think about doing those kinds of simulation games now, given where we're at with Quest and what's happening in the gaming industry, it must be so interesting for you just to take a step back and think about.
Well, the first breakthrough was Wolfenstein, right? That was the first 3D game you could play on a 2D screen, right? There weren't game consoles yet. And then along came Doom, which also was, I mean, it was a hallway shooter. You didn't have a whole lot of agency, but it showed the potential to create place using just a computer. And Second Life took that to the next level. Second Life had a lot of firsts, so that's why they at one point had 20 million users. The first virtual economy, the first social network, the first, open sandbox 3D virtual world. I was surprised it took that long for other people to come up with similar metaversy ideas. But on the other hand, that was the time when the game console was breaking, and gamers' attention was obviously on that because it was, a platform custom built for 3D games.
Now, this show Shift is about the future of work, and I know you think a lot about that. But one question I have for you, and I ask everybody this question, is what did your parents do? And did you guys talk about business at the dinner table? Was that something that came up in your family?
We did not talk about business at the dinner table. My father was a dentist. He worked extremely hard. He had 3 offices, and on the weekend he would play golf. That's what he did. That was his life. When he retired, he moved to Florida and played golf and cards every day and hung out with the same altercockers every day. That's the nightmare scenario of retirement because your world gets very, very small.
Yeah.
Now, he wanted that. He wanted his world to be small. I have the opposite impulse, right? I want my world to be very big. But my father and I were very different people, although we were closer when he got older. My mother, who died of cancer when she was 66, was an entrepreneur.
Interesting.
While she was raising her kids, she did not have a career. But as my brother and I entered high school, she started a business with a friend of hers called Witty Ditty.
What was Witty Diddy?
Witty Ditty was a singing telegram service that made custom songs.
Wow.
So she and her partner were songwriting partners, and they would take songs from Broadway shows, and bio would be filled out by the person ordering the song. And so it'd be Hello Dolly sung as Hello Morty. Well, hello Morty. And so that was I mean, not a huge business, but they ran it for probably the better part of 10 years. And when my father went to retire, she somehow figured out a sale to her partner that I don't think it was that clean as happens with those sorts of business. I think ultimately it sold to one of their singers whose parents put up the money, but we're not talking about a huge business
Yeah,
here.
that's cool though.
She did that when my father wanted to retire to Florida, which she was, ecstatic to do. Many of their friends had already moved to Florida. That is where their social network went to retire. So that is the bio of my parents. Very typical, upwardly mobile, middle to upper middle class Jews from, my father fought in World War II. He got out of dental school probably 6 months before the war started. He never was in combat. In fact, for most of the war, he did dentistry at a prisoner of war camp in Boston,
Interesting.
where he said he was tempted to hurt them, but he didn't. Instead, he made sure they knew he was Jewish.
Amazing.
So anyway, so he did not. He even though he rose to the rank of major and actually always had a positive feeling about his time in the army and his contribution to the war, never actually was in the shooting part of it.
Well, it's a good segue thinking about work back then, your mom and your dad, and then thinking about it now. I want to talk a little bit about your newest book, Remote Collaboration.
Yeah, I hardly ever talk about that book anymore. The world seems to have moved on.
I want to hear more about that. Tell me more about that book.
Well, we were quarantined, right? I was halfway through teaching my first college class at Chapman University, where I've been for 4 years now. And it was remote, and we really didn't know what to do. My entire lesson plan was kind of constructed about being in person. As it turns out, being remote was the ideal way to teach the subject matter that I was teaching, which is a survey of VR and AR. And in particular, because of the Quest, we spent a lot of time, everybody had a Quest, and we spent a lot of time in VR. So, you wear your Quest, you take it off, you have a conversation about the experience, you put your Quest back on. Visiting artists could easily pop in. So it occurred to me that there are some things that are done just as well remotely. And the benefits to society and to workers are great. The problem was, VR was not exactly ready for its close up. When the pandemic broke, it was, and, for most people, particularly older people, there is an adoption issue. People get sick, they get dizzy. So I don't know that VR is the ideal solution for most organizations. It's hard to take notes in VR. It's something you can't do for that long. Most people start to get claustrophobia after half an hour. The headset heats up. I like to play games sometimes that go on for over an hour, and I really get hot in the Quest. I bought a Quest Pro. That's a little better. It doesn't get as hot, but of course, it is not as immersive because your peripheral vision is in the physical world. But I like the fact that air moves through there. Anyway, the class went really well, and my quarantine classes were wonderful, in a way better than the classes had been since I went back to in person and was told unequivocally that there could be no remote classes.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, Chapman is weird about remote education. They had a very big problem with parents running school remotely. They objected to the cost because most of the cost of your, $60,000 education goes to the facilities. It doesn't go to the faculty that actually deliver the product, which is very ironic, I
Yeah.
think, and suggests that for many students, a remote experience would be less expensive, but perhaps equally effective. They would miss the experience of being in real life and, living with their peers for 4 years, but they would gain an experience which is more like work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, before going into the other books, I want to dig in a little bit to your comment about people moving on from remote collaboration. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, 2022, at least in my experience, and this is largely anecdotal, I know that there were a lot of people having issues with making the transition back to live because there are so many benefits to workers in being remote. But there are also a lot of issues that come up, and issues that eventually put enough pressure on management to really demand that people come back. And there are a few different reasons for that. One is serendipity. A lot happens in the hallway in an office, more than happens in an in-person meeting, I would say. There is a training issue. Most white-collar jobs work through a system of advocacy, observation, and mentorship. Right? I learn your job by sitting next to you doing my job. Eventually, I can do your job. You might be a mentor and not even know it, but remotely, there is no chance of that happening. Remotely, there is no chance if you're an engineer to walk in the office next door to say to somebody more senior, "Hey, I'm hung up." Right? It's much more complicated to do that remotely.
Yeah.
Uh, and then finally, and there are succession issues for management. They don't know who to promote because they're not seeing their interactions with other people. So, and also some people are better on Zoom than others. So leadership issues on Zoom are real and are to a certain extent based on how many Zoom calls you do. And I mean, there's a lot of factors that have nothing to do with work. And I think that management recognizes that a lot of energy, for all the time that's being saved, a lot of energy is being used trying to work in a different way. Personally, think the hybrid is going to be the norm for most white collar workers. That is, you got to come in Monday through Wednesday, but Thursday and Friday. It used to be Fridays were kind of an optional day, but they'll add Thursday to that, and that helps people who live 2 and 3 hours away as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's better schools, cheaper houses, and if you're only going to be there 1 or 2 days a week, you'll stay in a hotel for $200 or $300 a night. It's totally worth it, to pay a smaller mortgage and be proximate to schools that you feel good about sending your kids to. I think a lot of commuting hours have been saved, and certain people, mostly people without kids, were enormously productive during the pandemic. So there are all these positive and negative factors that are highly subjective. But I think based on the number of businesses, at least in tech, that have, and tech is the business where people are most likely to be remote, right? So,
Yeah.
so, it's interesting that tech has been pulling people back in gradually. So 2022, in my view, was very much the year of being in person, right? All of a sudden, instead of remote gigs, people were willing to fly me to Europe and South Korea and Dubai because they wanted me in person.
Yeah.
And it's much more expensive and much more difficult to transport all these atoms across the world as opposed to bits. So I just think 2022 was, people wanted that in-person experience.
Yeah. People were hungry to get back.
Yeah. And so 2023, I think, is going to be interesting because we're going to see kind of how this settles. Do we go 100% back, or are we in a kind of new normal? I certainly think people are taking less business trips. I know the demand for travel is high, but I think that's a lot of people who are remote from friends
Yeah.
and family. But again, people want to be in person. So there's been a lot of pent up demand. So again, it makes sense that in 2022, people who, whatever they thought about remote work, were anxious to get to distant employees. But VR played a role in people understanding that when you have to be apart, there is a way to be present. And that certainly, whatever happens with work, was great for VR.
Yeah, I believe that it is going to be a hybrid approach of some sort, that people will figure out what works well in person and what works well digitally, and they'll have a combination of those in their businesses. One of the things about some of the earlier books that you wrote, like Metaverse and Convergence, especially Metaverse, I was surprised to see how early you wrote that book, given the kind of hype around the word metaverse last year. I know you have some opinions about that, but it's interesting to me that that was the title of your book. Can you talk a little bit about, one, the hype, two, the book,
Sure.
and how that plays into how you think about things moving forward?
Sure. Well, the Metaverse book, if you looked at it, so first of all, it's an AR enabled book. You read it with your phone in your hand, and there's all sorts of animation that comes out of the book, and it's dimensional AR animation. We use Euphoria to anchor it to the page, and it's very early. It was 2018. People had never seen anything like that. Now there are augmented reality books all over the place, and that was a huge point of contention with the publisher, who did not want to cut the AR company into the distribution of the books. So, but the book was a big hit. which is really weird for a niche computer book that cost $50. We sold about 25,000 copies, which is just unheard of. And we had a bit of a struggle to name the book because it was about so many disparate things, right? I mean, it was about location-based entertainment. It was about devices. It was about, science fiction. It was about, the economics of VR. It was just about a lot of different topics. There were some other writers who contributed to the book, which I think was part of the reason for its success, right? So when you produce a play, you want an amateur production. You want as many people on stage as possible because it's their friends and relatives who come to the show. So it was sort of a little similar philosophy in writing the book. And I got some great people to contribute to it and subsequent book Convergence, which of course was a much better book, sold, 15% as many copies. But the first book, we couldn't figure out a name. And finally, my editorial assistant suggested Metaverse. And I liked the idea because I knew the meaning of Metaverse, was this sort of overarching computer network that would contain the internet and the digital twin and, AR and VR and make it a unified thing. So, I thought, oh, that's great. I'll call it Charlie Fink's Metaverse to distinguish it from Neil Stephenson and others' definitions, because I was using it as a metaphor. Right. The book is not about the actual metaverse, and I don't think I even mention it once in the text of the entire book. But it's the metaverse of everything being connected. And that's where that title came from. Now, of course, we had a nice surge in sales in the fall of 2021 when Metaverse Mania began with Facebook changing its name to Meta. But that was pretty short-lived because it wasn't hard to figure out that the book was mostly about VR and tethered VR at that. The book was trying to understand when it was going to be popular or if it was going to be popular and what the best use cases for VR were. So at that time, VR was a very niche technology.
What are your thoughts about the Metaverse mania that happened last year?
Well, it's interesting that Meta has lost control of the conversation about the metaverse since they started it. the the metaverse has been reduced down through this whole debate over the past, 15 months. Uh, it's been reduced down to Roblox. Basically, Roblox is the metaverse. But the truth is, the metaverse is in the eye of the beholder. It's a made-up word from science fiction. It's silly to argue about it. It's sort of arguing about cyberspace. It's just a word that, of the moment, of convenience, like the World Wide Web. I mean, these words will be supplanted by other brands, generally related to a device or a class of devices. People will, call it the Apple Gear or something at some point. So very often the product name becomes the name of the, idea.
Yeah.
So, but I do think that it is clear that a VR device, and this is where Matthew Ball and Tim Sweeney from Epic Games have made a good point, because VR headsets for widely distributed among hundreds of millions of people are a long way away. We can talk about that. There are a lot of different reasons for that, but I think we'll have great VR headsets coming out, but I don't see it increasing adoption that much
Let's
yet.
talk about that. Tell me more.
Well, let me finish the metaverse conversation a bit. So it's been distilled down to Roblox. Roblox has a lot to say for itself because it's got a creator economy, right? People can build things and get paid for building them. So they're the first company to do that, other than Second Life, or game companies obviously have currencies inside of their games and get points, and you spend those points on uniforms and skins and weapons or whatever, but you can't take them out of the game. But in Roblox, just like in Second Life, you actually can trade those points for fiat currency anytime you want. And in fact, Second Life has developed into a bank, and the banking business is it's how they monetize Second Life. And it actually is much bigger than Second Life, which, were it not for their virtual economy, wouldn't be around today, because, they have less than 1 million users to sustain it. But I should say that company still makes, upwards of $75 million a year. So it's not a nothing company, which is why it's owned by a hedge fund. Can't go public, but, shouldn't be in a venture portfolio. So Brad Oberweiger, who's, made cool food companies mostly and made hundreds of millions of dollars, now has a hedge fund. So he's friends with Philip Rosedale, the founder, who put him together with venture backers who wanted out. It was like the last asset in an old portfolio. So they were, they wanted to get out. They'd been in for 15 years or whatever. I think they were getting some distributions of cash, which I'm sure was nice, but it didn't fit in their investment thesis anymore.
Yeah.
So to me, I look at Second Life and I say, okay, that is a real metaverse. It's not connected to anything else that is getting figured out, but it has enormously important creator economy. VR chat better figure that out really fast, or they're going to go the way of AltSpace. AltSpace didn't develop a virtual economy. It was going to take a long time to do it. So when money gets tight, companies go looking for projects that aren't tied to revenue. And this is a moment when you're not nailed to revenue, you're getting thrown overboard. That's what happened to AltSpace. It was costing them tens of millions of dollars a year to host it, even though they're the second large cloud hosting company in the world. So I think that, Meta just shut down Echo, which is a very popular free game. I mean, again, they owned Ready at Dawn, the company that made it, and no revenue was coming in. So sort of like, why did we buy this company if it can't generate revenue? So they're shutting down Echo and they're having them work on other projects that they believe will have that they can sell.
Well, I think it speaks to what you talked about before a little bit, which is where we're at with the ecosystem, both on the software side and the hardware side.
I think last time we met, I pointed out, that Meta did its big fall Meta Jamboree or Meta Connect, right? And they always have a big keynote from Zuckerberg, and then, the lieutenants come up and show off different things. Of course, in 2021, they essentially made a science fiction movie to illustrate the power of the metaverse and the devices that could be produced to give us access to the metaverse. And so they did that version in 2022 and gleefully announced they had passed 10 million users, which, is sort of the minimum threshold to have a virtual economy or an economy of scale for game sales. They announced there are lots of companies making a nice revenue stream from Quest users. And they just surpassed, $1 billion in revenue generated from the Oculus Store. In the 2.5 years since it launched. The following week, Modern Warfare 4, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4 was released, and the first day it did 800 million, and after 2 weeks, it had done 1.5 billion. So in 2 weeks, they do 1.5 billion as a single console game. And then Meta, in 2.5 years, generates $1 billion and is celebrating that great achievement. So that gives you an idea of comparative scale and how far Meta is from having the kind of scale we see in a business like Activision, which is getting bought by Microsoft for $80 billion.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think that, that speaks to people's willingness to put on headsets? What are your thoughts about why it's taken so long for VR to take hold?
There are many factors here. So let me address this anecdotally, because people who use VR, right, we all use multiple screens, right? I look at my PC, I'm looking at my phone, I'm looking at my television, I look at a game. My life is ruled by screens. So that's just context. We have students at Chapman who have an XR minor and are building, VR experiences. And so these, are headset owners. And I always, when I see them in the fall, I always say, well, did you use your headset over the summer? What kind of games were you playing? And universally, I get the answer, I really like VR. And I like this game and I like that game and I love playing with my friends. But, I was really busy this summer. And when I wanted to play a game, it was just more convenient to play game console. And so what they're doing is they're praising VR, but it is faint praise. So that's like a friend asking, well, how's VR? Yeah, it's okay. I like it. But that is not, the kind of first adopter behavior that drives wide adoption.
Yeah.
So strike one. Strike two is friction. I don't think of it as a lot of friction, but, I'm in the computer business. So, I have a very high threshold for friction and I know how to troubleshoot things, usually by turning them on and off, by the way. I'm not a computer scientist. I've just been doing this a long time. The benefits have to obviously outweigh the friction. And I don't think VR has demonstrated that. There is no game on VR that is the equivalent of Call of Duty. If there were, they'd sell a lot more VR headsets. So I think you have kind of a use case issue because I think VR is trying to get gamers and they are highly satisfied with gaming consoles. So how do you get them from there into VR? How do I get that student who is engaged with his other screens to be engaged with VR? Because at the moment he prefers TikTok and Instagram to VR.
How about the future of work in VR?
Training and simulation are the killer app of VR, both for consumers and for enterprises. And it will only continue to grow in enterprise for training and simulation because it's better and they have a much higher threshold for friction. So, but it's, getting very accessible. The costs of it are accessible. The expertise of the workers is going up, their resistance. But again, it's just taking what's on the iPad and putting it on somebody's head, usually in the form of a micro display that just hangs off of a hard hat. And usually that's all the computer a worker needs to keep their hands free and do very sophisticated tasks. Typically has, a flashlight, a high definition camera, often voice control. So again, it's all about keeping a worker's hands free so that you can operate a forklift, or they used to use a combination of RF guns and, iPads. And so they leave RF guns all over a warehouse. People would just go grab from another, but now they have GPS or whatever that Apple technology is so that they can go collect them all at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, AR is sort of solving a lot of, and again, AR assisted reality versus AR as spatial computing. Right, that's what the HoloLens and the Magic Leap do. But assisted reality, which is coming to consumers, by the way, is just a micro display that either Bluetooths to a smartphone or a mini computer or even the network, around them if they're in a defined space, factory, offices, whatever.
Yeah, for workers with hands-free needs, that is key, even if they're just watching a video.
So again, this is a case where the benefits obviously outweigh the friction. There are other problems with enterprise. Adoption has been alarmingly slow, but they will eventually adopt the technology because it is a better way of doing it. But I think that people in technology don't understand how slowly business works. Accenture is a big proponent of VR. They have 800,000 employees embedded in Fortune 500 companies. Oftentimes you're in a company and you find out somebody is a McKinsey guy. He's not actually an employee, but they're indistinguishable. So that's the way this technology is going to slowly make its way into companies. Most companies don't have the convenience or I would say the money to have innovation offices. I'll bet you a lot of those innovation offices get closed if there's really a recession, which, as Scott Galloway describes the current situation, we are in a Patagonia vest recession, which is affecting higher income workers. I would also say this about remote work, just going back to that for a quick sec. I think anybody who is working remotely has to be worried that somebody in Pakistan could do their job. So getting back into the office may have more implications than they think. But I do think as a result of the pandemic, many more people are aware of VR. And there's a company, it's run by a guy named Devin Copley, who's a who's a Windows Phone guy from Nokia. And their product allows 8 people in VR to communicate with somebody in a remote location who has a GoPro camera on a stick. So 8 people are inside of a 360 video talking to an operator in the physical world. So you could walk through a factory in Shenzhen without somebody being there physically. And you can even go farther and say, can we get a close-up of that machine? Can we see those? What do the controls say? The kinds of things, the kind of details you would see just walking through there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's called Avatur. Avatur. They've raised some venture money. It's a really good idea. I think that's going to save companies a lot in travel. And I think that's the kind of place where VR, just like training people to ride forklifts and do welding is going to be very, very effective, whatever happens with consumer VR. Again, I don't think consumer VR is going away, and don't get me wrong, I do think it is great, but I've been on a long journey.
Seen a lot.
So it's only great compared to, everything else we've done. So, and by the way, I mean, I criticize Meta all the time, but thank God for them, because had they not purchased Oculus, you and I would probably not be having this conversation today. So as much criticism I have of the company, I also have a tremendous amount of gratitude. I also see them single-handedly, metaverse or no metaverse, bringing immersive technology to the public. With great conviction, with superhuman conviction, right? I mean, this is only Mark Zuckerberg in the world of billionaires. Only Mark Zuckerberg can do this. The guy has decided, to take on an historic task. And in my estimation, I don't think the company is doing terrible. But we have hit a spot where instead of selling 100 million, we're going to have to start thinking about the consumer business as being more similar to the Switch, where there are 20 million Nintendo Switches out there. Nintendo makes plenty of money from it, as do its software partners. But it's not knocking PlayStation 4 out of anybody's hands anytime soon. So that may be very well where we end up with VR. There are people who like playing games in VR and people who don't. But I think in enterprise, it's inevitable. It's unstoppable because it's too good of a solution at too low of a price, and at this point with very little friction.
In terms of the enterprise and work, I want to hear what you think about the way that work is going to change. And when you talk to your students, for example, what kind of advice do you give them as you look into the future and think about how work is going to change, not for us, but for them?
The first thing I say is they better learn how to learn, because they're going to have 40 jobs. Now, I only had like 15 jobs, but that's going to get worse, right? We're going to live in a more and more of a freelance world where people's expectations of their career are going to exist outside of companies. That's already happened. There's still people who, you hear of, who have worked for Google for 17 years, but I think the newer employees are probably cognizant of the fact that nothing lasts forever, and the company has very, very little loyalty to you, and so you return that attitude to the company, free lunch notwithstanding. So the first thing I say to them is, you better learn how to learn. I don't care if you find this topic stupid or you think I'm boring, but you're going to walk into a job and you're going to get about 40 hours of goodwill to learn your shit. And after that, you're going to be viewed as somebody who's either making or not making a contribution. And you better get rid of the idea that having a degree from a prestigious private institution helps you today at all, ever, because what employers look for are skills. So if you are worried about the future, you have control of that. You can acquire those skills. Now, I've told 300 plus students that if they spend 5 hours a week with a game engine, starting in September, that in May, when they graduate, I will get them an $80,000 a year job. And you know how many students have taken me up on that? Guess.
10%.
3.
3. That's incredible.
And you know what happened? I got them all jobs with the first phone call.
That's amazing.
And in fact, one of them was a junior and didn't come back. I hope nobody from Chapman is listening, because she agonized over it. The company was offering her $100,000 a year to stay. She was a mad modeler, and they really liked what her contribution was. And she said, "I feel like I'll never get my degree if I don't go back." And I said, "But what is your degree for? Like, who's going to not hire you because you don't have a degree?" Yeah. I mean, that's not that world is ending. This world is based on skills. So when you present yourself to an employer, you have to make a value proposition, not "I'm nobody, I'm nothing, I've had some education, make me into somebody." That's the way I did it. But that's not the way it works anymore. You need to approach a company and say, "I have these skills and I'm willing to use them on your behalf. And in exchange, I want money, mentorship, a chance to be creative, a possibility to advance." And so that's a reasonable exchange of value. Now, I also tell them, look, you don't have to be a Unity programmer, right? I mean, they're going to see if you suck. pretty quickly. But now you're inside, you can do another job. Right now, you don't know what other jobs there are inside of a big company. So get yourself some skills and get yourself into the biggest company, the biggest branded company you can for the first 3 to 5 years of your career. Because Disney, my 11-year career at Disney made me. Everybody who hired me subsequently said I hired a Disney guy. So I mean, Forbes is the same kind of brand. People, it confers upon you a tremendous amount of credibility. Oh, Charlie is an expert in XR because Forbes has anointed him an expert. And nobody knows what a shit show Forbes is. They're not even, if they read it, it would bounce off them because the Forbes brand is so old and so powerful. I'm lucky to be associated with it. I've been asked to write for other publications for much more money. I wouldn't trade the Forbes brand for anything. You can't put a value on something like that to my speaking business, my consulting business, so it's great. And Disney has been like that for my career.
One thing you said earlier, which I thought was really interesting about students that are coming into the workforce that are going to be in person, was around mentoring. I wonder if you could tell me just a little bit about mentors in your life that helped you professionally, if you think back, and how you think about mentorship in this new future of work.
First of all, most mentors don't know that they're mentors, right? It's a young person is observing you closely and advances on what they learned from you. So Jim Bankoff, who's running Vox Media, worked for me at AOL, and we saw in him his promise. And, during the Netscape acquisition, he got a spectacular promotion. So, that's mentorship. I don't think of myself as Jim's mentor. I don't think he thinks of me as his mentor. There are other people who very much think of me as their mentor, even though I don't think I did anything. What did they do? They spent a lot of time with me. The number one requirement is that they spent a lot of time with me. Was I their mentor? I don't know. When I was at Disney, I was just starting out in my career. The same thing when I started out in the motion picture business as an assistant. I learned a lot from Gary Marshall and his producing partner, Alex Rose. I learned how to conduct myself. I learned how to talk. I learned what people need to hear from you just by watching them. I don't think Gary ever thought he was my mentor. I'm still in touch with Alex. I think she probably did, but her mentoring style was let's just say it wasn't a priority for her. But again, I got a lot out of that. I got a lot out of having access to her Rolodex, her network. I got to go to cool meetings where, I learned how to be in those meetings. So much of it is the illusion of your self-confidence. When I worked at Disney, I worked for a guy named Peter Schneider, who was rising very quickly in that company and kind of brought me with him. I think one of my big regrets in life is not staying in animation. I really wanted to go to live action. They promoted me because of the Lion King thing. And I said, what I want more than a promotion is to move to live action. I don't think I really understood deeply enough how big animation was going to be. I went to live action. It was not my cup of tea, even though I worked on one of the company's biggest projects ever, which is the Homeward Bound franchise. We thought during the production that it was kind of a failure because we were so far over budget. And I felt like I got part of the blame for that. So they didn't renew my contract, and I was looking for a lifeboat desperately at Disney. They offered me a position back in animation, but I felt like, God, fuck, I would be going back there with my tail between my legs. I should have done it even then. Instead, I took Tim Disney up on his offer to work with him on this new location-based project. And I did have a very strong fear and feeling that this was the end of the domination of movies over popular culture. And that's true. Movies have disappeared as a driver of popular culture. TikTok is a driver of popular culture. So I sensed in 1992 that was the direction the world was going, and I didn't know how to be a part of it.
Interesting.
So I thought that virtual world might be a step in that direction. I was a little disappointed by the movie business, just because it is a difficult business in which you often have no control. So I was attracted to the technology business. I did not think I was going to become wealthy in the movie business. And so it worked out. That was my rationale for taking that opportunity with Tim rather than taking one of the other jobs that I was offered. It was reckless, but it worked out for me.
It's interesting. It points to your earlier comment about people getting back to work, people getting in person, having that FaceTime with people that could influence them over their lives. And sometimes it's not structured and direct. Sometimes it's just being in the same room with those people. I always like to end the show with a question that I'll ask you about the future of work. If you can describe what you think about work in the future in 2 words or less, how would you describe it?
Perilous and changing. And there's the word in Chinese for change. Famous John Kennedy quote is crisis. Crisis is an opportunity for change. I think AI may very well cause a crisis in employment. We may end up with a massive unemployment. We have a political system that is might not be able to handle that. Just because in American democracy, the ability to get things done is highly prescribed, and that is a feature, not a bug, that has served this country extremely well for 250 years. But I think the speed of technological change has caught up with that idea. And so I don't think that the government as constructed now is going to serve us as well as it has, right? Because in the 19th century, rushing off and doing something was often, you didn't have enough information. The size of the country at that time made it barely manageable. So we live in a different time, and we need to make changes that are extremely difficult to make. That's going to affect work. AI, which I don't know enough about, is a big wild card. And I would also say that the globalization of work is a thing.
Absolutely.
So if I'm graduating from college, those are both things that would deeply concern me. And I think that's going to come up in the middle of their careers as opposed to right now. Right now, I don't think it's a factor and probably won't be that big of a factor. 5 years is nothing. But in 15 years, when those students will still be young, by my standards, they'll be in their 30s, many types of work are going to be automated. This came to the middle class and lower middle class 20 years ago and has festered. And I think this is going to come to the upper middle class and the middle class. If you have a job that you can do remotely, I think you better consider that job can be replaced by somebody on the other side of the world, or you can become optional. Boaz is never around here. What are we paying him for?
Those two things are fascinating. And what's happened in the last 6 months with ChatGPT, I think speaks to that in combination with the way that remote work has spread across the world and how easy it is to hire people in different locations is both a challenge and an opportunity. So I think you're absolutely right.
ChatGPT is definitely coming for my job at Forbes. And I'll tell you why. Because I've been doing this for so long, part of the data that it ingested was my stories. So I said, write a story about virtual reality in the style of Charlie Fink. And it did great with the style and the structure, but it was completely free of facts and it was completely free of insights.
Right.
And, facts and insights are the important part.
That's the value.
But it really got the structure and the wherefore and the kinds of questions that I would ask about a story, like who are their competitors? How are they financed? How are they going to reach their audience? And so it got all of that, but just didn't have any company names or any facts. The company has raised money. So it defaulted to ridiculous generalities. But if I had fed this week's news into it and then asked it, right, if I had, all the articles I'm working from, all the trends that I'm observing, if I put that somehow into ChatGPT and said, write it in the style of Charlie Fink, I think it might do good.
That's amazing.
I think that we're, at a moment when asking questions is going to become an art form, right? Understanding how to phrase things while using AI is the new art form. But to somebody who knows how to do that, they can do the job of 20 people. So I don't think people are going away, but I think they're going to get much more productive. And I think that is potentially has implications for work that are going to be profound. It's scary.
It is scary and exciting. Charlie,
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. I was really excited to talk with you, and it's been a great conversation.
You ask great questions. We could go on for hours, and hopefully we will outside of this podcast, but I was very flattered to be asked. Thank you.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. I continue to be amazed by the guests we've had on the show, and I'm excited about the ones joining in the future. If you're a fan of the show, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review. I truly appreciate you spending your time